There is nothing more pathetic than a room full of socialites trying to buy a soul. They think if they purchase enough history, nobody will notice they are hollow inside. My name is Claire Kennedy. 14 years ago, my parents threw me away like broken trash because I wasn't perfect enough for their tableau. They called me clumsy while they let my sister gamble away our future. Now, I am watching them try to sell a legacy they never earned, unaware that the executioner is sitting in the back row. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The gavel was about to fall, and so were they. There is a specific smell to old money, a scent you can't bottle or buy. It is a mixture of beeswax polished dust that is older than the Constitution and the heavy velvet silence of secrets kept behind mahogany doors. The Vanderbilt and Sterling auction house reeked of it. I sat in the back row, seat 42, blending into the shadows of the gallery. I wasn't hiding exactly. I was simply unobtrusive. A woman in a charcoal-tailored suit, hair pulled back in a severe professional chignon, eyes hidden behind the tint of designer glasses. To the casual observer, I was just another bidder, perhaps a representative for a museum, or a bored heiress looking for a trinket. To the auctioneer, I was bidder 402, pre-vetted with a line of credit that could swallow this entire building whole. But to the three people currently making a grand theatrical entrance through the double doors at the front of the room, I was a ghost they had exorcised 14 years ago. My parents, Robert and Eleanor Kennedy, walked with the practiced gait of people who believe the world is watching them. My father wore his tuxedo like armor, his chin raised, offering a tight, benevolent smile to the room. My mother was draped in cobalt silk diamonds, glittering at her throat, her arm looped through his. Following closely behind them was Paige, my younger sister. At 26, she was the picture of youthful indulgence, scrolling disinterestedly on her phone, her posture slouching just enough to suggest she was bored by the opulence surrounding her. They looked for all intents and purposes like American royalty. But I was a professional appraiser. My entire career, my entire life was built on the ability to distinguish the authentic from the counterfeit, and from where I sat, the cracks in their veneer were screaming. I adjusted my glasses, zooming in with a clinical detachment. My father's tuxedo was a season too old, and if you looked closely at the left cuff, the fabric was just beginning to fray a detail. He would have died before allowing in public a decade ago. My mother's smile didn't reach her eyes. There was a nervous tick in her jaw, a rhythmic clenching of teeth that betrayed a terrifying anxiety. And the diamonds paste. High-quality paste, certainly likely vintage costume jewelry from the 1950s, but they lacked the cold, sharp fire of the real stones she used to own. They were putting on a show, a desperate final performance. They weren't here to buy. They were here to liquidate the last thing they had left, the Kennedy collection. The catalog in my lap felt heavy. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Lot 1, 18th century French tapestry. Lot 5, the Kennedy Jade Dragon. Lot 12, Ming Dynasty, porcelain vase. These were the treasures of my grandmother, Evelyn Kennedy. She had been the matriarch, the steel spine of the family, and she had passed away 5 years ago. Now her son and his wife were stripping her legacy for parts. I knew why, of course. My network in the city was vast. I knew about the mortgages taken out on the family estate in the Hamptons. I knew about the maxed-out credit lines. But mostly, I knew about Paige's gambling debts. The golden child had a habit of losing 6 figures in a weekend in Macau, and my parents, desperate to maintain the illusion of their perfect daughter, had paid and paid until the well ran dry. Now they were selling the past to pay for her mistakes. It was almost poetic. They were selling the very items they had accused me of being too clumsy to handle. The memory hit me then, sharp and cold, cutting through the warm air of the auction house. I was 15 again. The living room carpet was Persian rough against my knees. The air smelled of lilies and catastrophe. I was on the floor frantically trying to gather the shards of blue and white porcelain. I hadn't even been running. I had just turned too quickly, my school bag catching the edge of the pedestal. Gravity did the rest. "You clumsy, stupid girl," My mother's voice had been a shriek devoid of any maternal warmth. She hadn't asked if I was cut. She hadn't asked if I was okay. She had looked at the shattered vase, a Qing dynasty piece valuable but insured, and then she had looked at me with pure, unadulterated loathing. "It's a curse," my father had muttered, pouring himself a scotch, not even looking at me. "Everything she touches ruins. She's a bull in a china shop, Eleanor. I told you. She's not like Paige. Paige has grace. Claire is a liability." That night had been the end of my life as their daughter. It wasn't just the vase. The vase was merely the excuse they had been waiting for. They wanted a perfect tableau. The handsome father, the beautiful mother, the pristine daughter. I was awkward. I was bookish. I asked difficult questions. I didn't fit the frame. So, they removed me. Within a week, I was packed off to a boarding school in Switzerland that functioned more like a holding facility for unwanted wealthy children. They cut off my allowance. They stopped calling. When holidays came, I was told it was better for my character to stay at school. They effectively orphaned me, not because I was wicked, but because I was inconvenient. I looked at Paige, now sitting in the front row, yawning. She had never been held accountable for anything in her life. If she broke a vase, it was the maid's fault for placing it there. If she crashed a car, it was the mechanic's fault. If she gambled away the family fortune, well, surely there was an heirloom to sell to fix it. But they didn't know what happened to the girl they exiled. They didn't know that the clumsy girl had found solace in the very objects they worshipped. In Switzerland, I didn't just study. I obsessed. I spent my weekends in museums, my summers interning at restoration labs. I learned the chemistry of varnish, the weave of canvas, the specific density of gold. I learned to see the history in an object, the soul of the craftsman. I built a reputation. I became Claire Kennedy, the Eye of New York, the youngest senior appraiser in the history of the aesthetic arts. I made my own fortune brick by brick, deal by deal. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. But I did need justice. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. The sound echoed through the room, snapping me back to the present. My parents straightened up, their faces masks of eager anticipation. They thought this auction was their salvation. They thought the money from grandmother Evelyn's treasures would wipe the slate clean, allowing them to retreat back into their bubble of delusion. They had no idea that the woman sitting in seat 42, the woman holding the paddle that would decide their fate, was the curse they had cast out. I watched them, feeling a cold, hard knot in my chest. It wasn't hatred exactly. It was something sharper. It was the absolute clarity of someone who has been underestimated for too long. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, not clumsy. I picked up the paddle. The game was about to begin, and for the first time in my life, I controlled the rules. I sat there watching the people who threw me away like broken trash, realizing that their rejection was actually my making. But it's a heavy weight to carry, isn't it? Being the one blamed for everything just so someone else can remain perfect. If you have gone through this, if you felt the pain of being the family's scapegoat, or faced betrayal from the very people supposed to protect you, please leave a comment below. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. The auctioneer, a man named Mr. Henderson, with a voice like gravel wrapped in silk, cleared his throat. The room fell into a hush, the kind of silence that usually precedes a prayer or an execution. I sat perfectly still, my paddle resting on my knee, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. The first few lots were minor pieces, a set of silver candelabras, a first edition of The Great Gatsby that I knew had a water stain on page 42, and a collection of vintage fountain pens. These were the appetizers, the small morsels meant to whet the appetite of the room before the main course was served. I watched my parents as the bidding began. With every sale, no matter how small, their posture relaxed slightly. When the candelabras went for $3,000, hardly a fortune but cash in hand, my mother let out a breath that ruffled the feathers of her stole. She leaned into my father, whispering something that made him nod vigorously. They were doing mental arithmetic, calculating how many more sales it would take to keep the wolves from the door. They were terrified, yes, but they were also arrogant enough to believe that the world owed them a rescue. Standing just to the left of their seated grandeur was Arthur Sterling. At 70, Arthur was the oldest practicing attorney at his firm, a man of immense intellect and integrity, yet my father treated him like a coat check attendant. Robert snapped his fingers at Arthur, pointing to his empty water glass. Arthur, dignified in his worn tweed suit, simply signaled a waiter with a subtle raise of his hand, refusing to be baited. Arthur had been my grandmother Evelyn's confidant, the keeper of her secrets, and the executor of her will. He was the only person in that family who had ever looked at me with anything other than disappointment. As the waiter refilled the glass, Arthur's eyes scanned the room. They swept over the rows of bidders, the collectors, the dealers, the socialites, and for the briefest of seconds, they locked onto mine in the back row. He gave a nod so imperceptible that if I had blinked, I would have missed it. It was the signal. The trap was set. It was time to wake the room up. The auctioneer announced Lot 15, a pair of mid-century oil paintings, ostensibly by a renowned local artist from the Hampton School. Starting bid at $5,000, Henderson announced. The room was tepid. A hand went up in the front row. $5,000. Do I hear 6? Silence. My parents shifted uncomfortably. This was the honeypot phase of my plan. I needed to drive the prices up to inflate their ego and their expectations so high that the eventual fall would be fatal. I needed them to believe that a savior had arrived. I raised my paddle. 10,000, I said, my voice projecting clearly from the shadows. Heads turned. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Doubling the opening bid was aggressive. It was a power move. Henderson's eyebrows raised. 10,000 from the bidder in the back. Do I hear 12? The previous bidder, intimidated, shook his head. Sold to bidder 402 for $10,000. I saw my father twist in his seat, craning his neck to see who had just overpaid for 2 mediocre landscapes. He couldn't see my face through the glare of the lights in my dark glasses, but I saw his smile. It was greedy, predatory. He nudged Paige, pointing at the catalog, likely telling her that they were going to be rich again. Paige, barely looking up from her phone, offered a lazy shrug. She was so accustomed to being rescued that the mechanics of it bored her. I didn't stop there. For the next hour, I played the room like a fiddle. I bid on the porcelain teacups. I bid on the antique globe. I drove the price of a set of velvet armchairs to 3 times their estimate. I created a buzz, a palpable energy in the room that the Kennedy collection was the hot ticket of the season. My parents were practically glowing. They were no longer sweating. They were preening. They were being validated. The market was telling them that they were important, that their possessions were desirable, that they were still the Kennedys of Park Avenue. They didn't know I was buying my own inheritance. They didn't know I was building a paper tower of wealth that I intended to burn down. But every plan has a variable you can't control. Mine came in the form of Julian Thorne. Thorne was a shark, a notorious private collector known for 2 things, his bottomless pockets and his complete lack of taste. He bought things, not because he loved them, but because they were expensive. When Lot 24 came up, a sapphire brooch that my mother claimed had belonged to a Russian Countess, Thorne sat up straighter. I knew the brooch. I knew it was a high-quality reproduction made in the 1980s, not a 19th century imperial treasure. But Thorne didn't know that. And if he bought it, the money would go to my parents and the evidence of their fraud would disappear into his private vault. I needed to win every single fake item to prove the deception. 20,000, Thorne barked before the auctioneer could even finish the description. He turned in his seat, glaring at me, challenging bidder 402 to a duel. I raised my paddle. 25. 30, Thorne countered instantly. My parents were ecstatic. They were watching a bidding war erupt over a piece of jewelry they probably found in a drawer. If I kept bidding, I would eventually win, but I would be spending millions of dollars unnecessarily. And worse, I risked Thorne taking it personally and outbidding me out of spite on the later items. I couldn't let him have it. But I couldn't just outspend him. I had to outsmart him. I had to use my cover as a knowledgeable expert to scare him off. 35, I said, but this time I stood up. I didn't walk into the light, but I moved enough to catch Thorne's attention. I took off my glasses, letting them hang on the chain, and pulled a jeweler's loop from my pocket, making a show of inspecting the image of the brooch on the large screen. I let out a sharp, derisive laugh, short, harsh, and loud enough to cut through the tension. 40,000, Thorne yelled, but his voice wavered. He hated looking foolish. I sat back down, leaning forward as if to conspire with the person next to me, but projecting my voice toward Thorne. The setting is wrong, I said, my tone dripping with professional disdain. Look at the bezel. It's machine cast. A Russian imperial piece would be hand-hammered. It's a lovely reproduction, but for 40,000, I let the sentence hang in the air unfinished, implying that only an idiot would pay that price. The room went silent. A few whispers broke out. Thorne froze. He looked at the screen, then at me, then at the auctioneer. Doubt crashed over him. He wasn't an expert. He was a wallet. If he bought a fake, he would be the laughingstock of the collector's circle. The auctioneer looked nervous. We have a bid of 40,000. Do I hear 45? I stayed silent. I didn't bid. I had cast doubt on the item. If Thorne bought it now, he was buying a potential scandal. I withdraw my bid, Thorne snapped, crossing his arms and sinking into his chair. I'm not paying 40,000 for a question mark. The room gasped. My parents looked horrified. The price plummeted back to my last bid. We revert to the previous bid of 35,000, to bidder 402, the auctioneer stammered, looking relieved to salvage the sale. Going once, going twice, sold. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The gavel banged. I had won the brooch. My parents looked shaken by the sudden volatility, but they were still $35,000 richer, or so they thought. I had protected the lot. I had secured the evidence. The hurdle was cleared, but the biggest challenge was still to come. The Jade Dragon was next, and I knew that for that piece, I wouldn't just need to outbid a rival. I would need to destroy a reality. As the auctioneer prepared the next lot, I caught Arthur's eye again. He didn't nod this time. He just closed his briefcase and set it on the table. The time for games was over. The time for truth had arrived. The air in the room changed when the attendants wheeled out the final lot. It was heavy, charged with the static electricity of pure avarice. The Kennedy Jade Dragon was not merely a statue. It was a legend in the New York antique circuit. Reputed to be a Qing dynasty masterpiece carved from a single boulder of imperial jade, it was the anchor of my family's financial fantasy. My parents leaned forward, their faces flushed with a mixture of greed and relief. They believed that in a few minutes, this greenstone would solve everything. It would erase the gambling debts, the second mortgages, and the shame of their declining relevance. They looked at the dragon with more love than they had ever looked at me. We opened the bidding at $500,000. Mr. Henderson announced, his voice trembling slightly. This was the highlight of his career, too. The paddles shot up like gunfire. 600,000, 800,000. The price climbed with dizzying speed. My parents were clutching each other's hands, my mother actually weeping tears of joy as the number crossed 1 million. They were saved. They were vindicated. The shark Julian Thorne was back in the fray, desperate to redeem himself after the brooch incident. He shouted, 1.5 million. The room went quiet. That was a serious number. My father pumped his fist subtly, a victorious grimace on his face. He thought it was over. He thought he had won. I waited until the silence stretched to its breaking point. I waited until the auctioneer raised his gavel to close the sale. Then I raised my paddle, not with a frantic wave, but with a slow, deliberate movement. $3 million, I said. The sound that followed wasn't a gasp. It was a vacuum. The air was sucked out of the room. 3 million was an absurd, offensive amount of money. It was double the current bid. It was an amount that screamed dominance. Julian Thorne turned purple and threw his paddle onto the floor. My parents looked toward the back row, trying to pierce the darkness to see their savior. They were practically vibrating. $3 million didn't just pay their debts, it restored their empire. Going once, Henderson squeaked his composure, gone. Going twice, sold to the lady in the back for $3 million. The gavel slammed down, sounding like a gunshot. The room erupted in polite applause, my parents hugging each other as if they had just won the lottery. But I didn't wait for the attendant to bring the paperwork to me. I stood up. The applause faltered as I began to walk down the center aisle. I moved with a predator's grace, my heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic warning against the hardwood floor. I didn't stop at the clerk's desk. I walked past the security guards, past the stunned bidders, and right up to the podium where the dragon sat under a spotlight. "Excuse me, madam," the auctioneer sputtered, reaching out a hand. "The paperwork is—" "I require a loop," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs, "and a UV light. I believe this item has been misrepresented." My father stood up, his face twisting from joy to indignation. "This is highly irregular. That is the Kennedy dragon. Who do you think you are?" My mother chimed in, her voice shrill. "Security, remove this woman. She's trying to devalue our property." I ignored them. I reached into my own pocket and produced my professional-grade lighted loop. I stepped into the spotlight, the heat of it beating down on my neck. I leaned over the dragon, bringing the lens to the intricate carving of the scales. "Madam, you cannot just—" My father started stepping into the aisle, aggressive now. I stood up straight and turned to face them. The house lights were bright, but I was standing in the glare of the stage. I reached up and slowly removed my dark sunglasses. I unpinned the chignon, letting my hair fall around my face. I looked directly at Robert and Eleanor Kennedy. I saw the confusion in their eyes first, then the recognition, and finally the horror. "Hello, Father," I said. "Hello, Mother." "Claire." My mother whispered the name, tasting like ash in her mouth. What are you doing here?" "I'm here to buy the family treasures," I said, my voice amplified by the acoustics of the stage. Or I would be, if there were any treasures here to buy. "How dare you?" my father hissed, though he looked pale. "You were always jealous, always spiteful. You're trying to ruin us because we sent you away." "I'm not trying to ruin you," I said calmly. "I'm trying to stop you from committing grand larceny." I turned back to the audience, addressing the room of billionaires and collectors. I held up the loop. "I am Claire Kennedy, senior appraiser for the International Heritage Trust, and I am telling you that this item is a fake." The room exploded, shouts of denial, gasps of shock. "Liar," my father screamed. "That has been in our family for 80 years. The original was," I corrected him loud and clear. "But this," I tapped the dragon's snout. "Look closely. The carving in the nostrils shows distinct rhythmic striations. Those are marks from a high-speed diamond rotary tool invented in the 20th century. The Qing dynasty didn't have power tools." I pulled a small UV flashlight from my pocket and shone it on the jade. Under the ultraviolet light, the stone didn't glow with a natural fluorescence. It bled a sickly, patchy purple. "And this fluorescence? This indicates polymer impregnation and synthetic dyeing. This isn't imperial jade. It's bleached quartz, dyed green, and stabilized with resin." I looked at my parents. They were frozen, their mouths open, their eyes wide with panic. They looked like statues themselves, statues of ruins. "It's not just the dragon," I continued, gesturing to the entire stage. "The Ming vase, modern slip-casting seams on the interior. The French tapestry, machine-woven synthetic fibers. The painting's high-quality giclée prints with textured varnish on top." "You're lying," my mother shrieked, clutching her chest. "Mother gave us these." "She wouldn't. Grandmother Evelyn knew exactly who you were," I said, and the silence that followed was absolute. "She knew you valued the appearance of wealth more than the substance of it. She knew that the moment she was gone, you would sell her legacy to fund your vanity and Paige's vices." I saw Paige shrink into her seat, trying to make herself invisible. "So," I said, delivering the final blow, 10 years ago, she commissioned these replicas. She paid a fortune for the best forgeries money could buy just to keep you happy, just to keep you fooled. Then where are they? My father croaked, his voice broken. Where are the real ones? Safe, I said. Somewhere you can never touch them. The illusion shattered. The sound was deafening, not physically, but socially. I watched the realization wash over the room. The Vanderbilt and Sterling auction house had almost sold millions of dollars worth of fakes. The reputation of the house was at risk. The reputation of the Kennedys was annihilated. My parents stood in the center of the ruin they had built, stripped of their lies, exposed as frauds who didn't even know their own family history well enough to spot a counterfeit. I stood on the stage, the only real thing in a room full of fakes, and for the first time in 14 years, I didn't feel like the broken daughter. I felt like the judge. The murmurs turned into angry shouts from the bidders. Security guards were moving not toward me, but toward the stage to secure the evidence. My parents looked small, withered, and utterly defeated. It is a terrible thing to realize that the safety net you thought you had was woven from your own lies. If you have ever been the one to pull back the curtain and reveal a painful truth, or if you have faced the backlash of exposing a family secret to protect what is right, please leave a comment below. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The silence that had followed my revelation broke like a dam replaced by a torrent of accusatory noise. My father, Robert, scrambled up the steps of the stage, his face a mottled map of crimson rage and chalk-white panic. He didn't look at the fake jade dragon anymore. He looked at me as if I were a monster he had accidentally created. "You thief!" he bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain of his hysteria. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest, disregarding the security guards who were now tentatively closing in. "You stole them. You must have. You were always sneaking around, always jealous of what we had. You switched them. Arthur, Arthur, call the police. Have her arrested immediately." My mother, Eleanor, wasn't screaming. She was hyperventilating, clutching the podium for support. Her eyes darting around the room, seeing her social standing evaporate in real time. "The bad seed," she muttered loud enough for the microphone to catch. "I told you, Robert. She's cursed. She's come back to destroy us. She's stolen our property." They turned in unison toward Arthur Sterling. To them, he was just a fixture of the estate, a legal mechanic whose job was to keep the engine of their lifestyle running. They expected him to jump to their defense to produce a cease and desist order to bully the auction house into submission. "Arthur," my father commanded, wiping sweat from his upper lip, tell them about the insurance appraisal. Tell them these are genuine. Tell this woman that she is lying. I didn't move. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to." I looked at Arthur, who was standing calmly by his table, his hand resting on the leather handle of his briefcase. He looked at my parents with a profound, weary pity. He didn't reach for his phone to call the police. Instead, he picked up his briefcase and walked slowly up the stairs to the stage. The heavy thud of his dress shoes was the only sound in the room as the audience leaned in, sensing the final act of the tragedy. Arthur stopped between me and my parents. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Robert. "I cannot do that, Robert," Arthur said, his voice level and devoid of subservience. "Because Ms. Kennedy is telling the truth." "What?" My father staggered back as if slapped. "You work for us, Arthur. You represent this family." "I represented Evelyn Kennedy," Arthur corrected sharply, "and I represent her estate. My duty was to her wishes, and her wishes were specific." With a deliberate click, Arthur unsnapped the latches of his briefcase. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal backing. It wasn't fresh paper. The edges were slightly yellowed, the cover worn. It was old. 10 years ago. Arthur began addressing the room rather than my parents. Evelyn came to my office. She was heartbroken. She had discovered that her granddaughter Paige had begun stealing silver from the house to pawn for gambling debts. A gasp went through the crowd. In the front row, Paige shrank into her chair, shielding her face with her handbag. Evelyn also knew, Arthur continued, turning his gaze to my parents, that you, Robert and Eleanor, were aware of the theft and did nothing. You covered it up, you enabled it. She realized then that her legacy, the collection she and your father built over 50 years, was not safe with you. She knew that the moment she died, you would sell it all to maintain a facade of wealth you hadn't earned. That's a lie, my mother shrieked, but her voice lacked conviction. It is a matter of public record, Eleanor, Arthur said, holding up the document. This is the Evelyn Kennedy Preservation Trust, established a decade ago. At that time, Evelyn commissioned the replicas you see here on this stage. She spent a small fortune on them. She swapped them out piece by piece over the course of a year. You never noticed because you never looked at the art. You only looked at the insurance value. My father was shaking his head, a look of utter incomprehension on his face. But the will, everything was left to us. The house was left to you, Arthur said. The cash accounts were left to you, and you spent them all. But the personal effects, specifically the contents of the collection, were placed into the trust. Arthur turned to me then. His expression softened the professional mask, slipping just enough to reveal the fondness of an old friend. He walked over and placed the document in my hands. It felt heavy not with paper, but with history. The trust dictates that the collection is to be held by the only member of the family who demonstrated an appreciation for the history and artistry of the pieces, Arthur announced. The sole beneficiary and trustee is Claire Kennedy. The gavel of justice had fallen not from the auctioneer, but from the grave. My parents looked at the document in my hands, and then at the fake dragon, and finally at the room full of people who were now openly staring at them with disdain. The auctioneer, Mr. Henderson, looked sick. He signaled to his staff. Cancel the sale. He barked, his voice tight. Cancel everything. Refund the deposits. Get these things off my stage. You can't do this, my father cried, grabbing Arthur's arm. We have debts, Arthur. We have loans coming due next week. If we don't sell these, we're ruined. We'll lose the house. We'll lose everything. Arthur gently but firmly removed my father's hand from his sleeve. You lost everything 10 years ago, Robert. You just didn't realize it until now. The security guards finally moved in. They didn't arrest anyone being broke, and delusional isn't a crime yet. But they began to escort my parents off the stage to clear the way for the removal of the fakes. The humiliation was absolute. The audience, the friends my parents had preened for, turned their backs. I saw Julian Thorne, the shark, laughing as he gathered his coat. The high society of New York does not forgive poverty, but it absolutely executes fraud. I stood there clutching the trust documents. I watched my parents being led away, arguing with each other, blaming each other, their voices fading into the background noise of the dismantling auction. Paige hurried after them, not to comfort them, but likely to beg for a ride before the car was repossessed. They were a family bound only by shared greed, and now that the glue was gone, they were falling apart. Arthur stood beside me. She was very proud of you, he said quietly. She followed your career. She kept every article, every auction result. She wanted to tell you, but she was afraid they would punish you further if they knew you were successful. She wanted you to be ready. I looked down at the fake jade dragon, the symbol of their lies. I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The anger was gone. The need for revenge had evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of closure. I hadn't just won. I had been chosen. My grandmother hadn't abandoned me. She had been protecting me and herself the whole time. I'm ready, Arthur, I said. Good, he smiled. Because there is a lot of paperwork to do. The real collection has been in a climate-controlled vault in Zurich. It's waiting for you. As the room emptied, leaving my parents to their fate on the sidewalk outside, I realized that the best revenge wasn't screaming or fighting. It was simply being the person they said I could never be. It was competence. It was integrity. And it was final. Dealing with toxic family members who value money over blood is a scar that never fully fades. If you have ever had to stand your ground against your own family to protect your peace, or your legacy, or if you've watched the perfect golden child crumble while you had to build yourself up from nothing, please leave a comment below. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The adrenaline that fuels a confrontation is a volatile substance. When it evaporates, it leaves behind a strange, hollow clarity. The auction house was nearly empty now, save for the porters who were sullenly dismantling the display cases and the administrative staff, who looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. I sat at a small side table in the manager's office, the scratching of my pen the only sound in the room. I was signing document after document, transferring the trusteeship of the Evelyn Kennedy collection fully into my name. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel the urge to cheer. Victory, I was learning, was quiet. It was the sound of ink drying on a page. It was the heavy, reassuring thud of a stamp confirming that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. My parents were gone. Security had escorted them out 10 minutes ago, their protests fading into the hum of the city street outside. I imagined them standing on the sidewalk, shivering in the evening chill, waiting for a car service that might no longer accept their account number. But just as I was capping my pen, the door to the office creaked open. It wasn't my parents. It was Paige. My sister looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Stripped of the entourage and the arrogance, she was just a young woman in a dress that was too expensive for the reality she was about to face. Her mascara was smudged a dark bruise against her pale skin. She stood in the doorway, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She didn't look at Arthur, who was organizing the files in his briefcase. She looked at me. "Claire," she said, her voice trembling. It was the first time she'd spoken my name in 14 years without a sneer. I didn't stand up. I remained seated, my hands folded on the table. "Paige?" She took a step forward, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a script she had lost. "Mom and Dad? They're outside. They're really freaking out, Claire. Dad's saying he's going to sue, but Mom is just crying." She paused, licking her lips. "They need cash for a hotel. The cards were declined, just for tonight. And, well, I have some debts, small ones. But people are going to be looking for me. If you could just front us alone, just until we sort out the misunderstanding about the trust." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fear, yes, but I also saw the profound entitlement that had rotted her potential from the inside out. She still didn't get it. She thought this was a cash flow problem. She didn't realize it was an existential one. "There is no misunderstanding, Paige," I said softly, "and I am not a bank. But we're family." She burst out, the tears finally spilling over. "You can't just leave us on the street. You have millions, you just bought well, you have the trust. We're sisters. We share DNA," I corrected her. "We don't share a life." When I was 15 and sleeping in a dormitory in Switzerland, wondering why my parents hated me, where were you? When I was working 3 jobs to pay for my appraisal certification because I had been cut off, where were you? "I was a kid," she sobbed. "You were," I agreed. "But you're an adult now, and this is what adulthood looks like." I reached into my purse. For a second, her eyes lit up, thinking I was reaching for a checkbook. Instead, I pulled out a business card for a reputable recruitment agency in the city when I used to find staff for my gallery. I slid it across the table. "Resilience is learned, Paige. It's a muscle. You have never had to use it, so you're weak. But you can learn. Start now." She stared at the card as if it were an insult. Then, with a noise of pure frustration, she turned and ran out of the room. I listened to her footsteps recede, feeling a twinge of sadness, but no guilt. I couldn't save her from the fire she had helped stoke. She had to walk through it herself. Arthur clicked his briefcase shut. He looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That was harder than the bidding war I imagine." "A different kind of cost," I replied, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "Is everything ready?" "It is," Arthur said. "I had the crates moved from the secure storage in Zurich to your gallery's vault this morning. I thought it would be appropriate for you to end the night with the truth." We left the auction house through the back exit, avoiding the spectacle on the front steps. The city night was cool and crisp, smelling of rain and asphalt. We got into Arthur's town car, and the silence of the drive was companionable. We drove away from the illusion of the Vanderbilt and Sterling auction, away from the pretense, and toward the Upper East Side to a quiet street lined with brownstones. We stopped in front of a modest, elegant building with a brass plaque, Kennedy Fine Arts. This was my sanctuary. This was the world I had built. I unlocked the door, disabling the alarm with a code my parents would never guess. The air inside was cool and smelled of lavender and old paper. We walked past the showroom, past the pieces I had curated for clients, and into the private viewing room at the back. There, resting on a velvet-draped table, were the crates. They had been opened, the packing straw pushed aside. I walked over to the center crate. My breath caught in my throat. There it was, the real Kennedy jade dragon. Even in the dim light of the viewing room, it was incomparable. Unlike the dead-dyed stone on the auction stage, this jade seemed to hold light inside it. It was a deep, translucent spinach green, oily and rich. The carving was fluid, the dragon's body twisting with a life and energy that no machine could replicate. It was imperfect in the way only nature is imperfect, with subtle inclusions that proved its provenance. It was beautiful. But my eyes drifted to the crate beside it. Inside sat a blue and white Ming vase. It wasn't the one I had broken. That one was gone forever, dust in a landfill. But this was its twin, the mate to the pair. My grandmother had kept it safe all these years. I reached out my hand, trembling slightly. "Go on," Arthur whispered. I wrapped my fingers around the neck of the vase. The porcelain was cool and smooth like glass. I lifted it. It was heavy. For 14 years, I had carried the label, clumsy. I had believed deep down in the darkest parts of my psyche that my hands were cursed, that I was destined to destroy beautiful things. My parents had repeated the lie so often that it had become my gravity. But as I held the vase, feeling its balance, feeling the perfect distribution of its weight, I realized the truth. I wasn't clumsy. I had been a terrified 15-year-old girl walking on eggshells in a house where love was conditional. I hadn't dropped the vase because I was broken. I had dropped it because I was shaking from the pressure of trying to be perfect for people who would never be satisfied. I held the vase steady. My hands were strong. My grip was sure. I was a master of my craft. I was the protector of this legacy, not its destroyer. She knew, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Grandma Evelyn knew I could do this. She never doubted it, Arthur said, placing a hand on my shoulder. She told me once, Claire's the only one who looks at the vase and sees the art, not the dollar sign. That is why she will save us. I set the vase down gently with the reverence it deserved. I looked around the room at the paintings, the tapestries, the history that was now mine to guard. I thought of my parents chasing the phantom of wealth while standing in the ruins of their character. They had lost everything because they didn't know the value of what they held. They thought value was a price tag. I knew value was the story, the care, the truth. I turned to Arthur, the only family I had left, and smiled. It was a real smile, unburdened by the past. Thank you, Arthur, for everything. It was an honor, Claire, he replied. I looked back at the dragon one last time. The curse was broken. The ghost was exorcised. I was Claire Kennedy, and I was finally home. It takes a lifetime to unlearn the lies we are told about ourselves, especially when those lies come from the people who raised us. But standing there, surrounded by the truth, I realized that we get to define our own worth. If you have ever had to rebuild your self-esteem after years of being told you weren't enough, or if you found your true family in friends and mentors rather than blood relations, please leave a comment below. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. That brings us to the end of Claire's journey, a powerful reminder that sometimes the best revenge is simply knowing your own worth. Have you ever dealt with family members who valued their image more than their own flesh and blood, or had to prove everyone wrong to find your peace? Don't be shy to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.